The bones and ligaments of the head and neck form part of the axial skeleton, which consists of all of the bones which lie around the longitudinal axis of the human body. You can imagine the axial skeleton like an imaginary vertical line that runs through the body's centre of gravity from the head to the space between the feet. So we begin with the skull, and the skull forms the bony framework or the supporting structure of the head. It contains 22 individual bones, not including the bones of the middle ear, and it rests on the superior end of the vertebral column. The bones of the skull are grouped into two categories: cranial bones and facial bones. The cranial bones form the cranial cavity and enclose and protect the brain. These bones include our frontal bone, two parietal bones, two temporal bones, the occipital bone, sphenoid bone, and ethmoid bone. The facial bones form the face and include two nasal bones, two maxillary bones, two zygomatic bones, the mandible, and two lacrimal bones, among others. So taking a look at each of these bones in more detail, and the frontal bone forms the forehead, or the anterior portion of the skull, as well as the roof of the eye socket. So if this is one of our eye sockets here, you can see the top part, or the roof of that eye socket, is formed by our frontal bone. Posterior to the frontal bone are our two parietal bones, one on each side of the skull. And these form the larger portion of the sides and the roof of the cranial cavity. The paired temporal bones are these purple bones here, so we have one on either side. And they form the lateral aspects of the cranial cavity externally, as well as the inferior floor of the cranial cavity internally. Within the temporal bones are the mandibular fosses. So that is this indent here on the purple bone, which is the socket which articulates with the mandibular condyle on the mandibular bone. This forms our temporomandibular joint, or our jaw. Posterior to this joint, but also within the temporal bone, is our mastoid process. This is a rounded projection that you can kind of feel just behind your ear. And that's posterior and inferior to our external auditory or acoustic meatus, which is this opening here, which forms the external auditory canal that goes into your ear. The occipital bone forms the posterior and base of the cranial cavity. We can also see the occipital bone from a posterior and an inferior angle. The occipital bone contains a large hole called the foramen magnum. So foramen means hole and magnum means large. This is where the bottom of the brainstem and the spinal cord will exit the cranial cavity. Also on the occipital bone is the occipital condyles. So they are these structures here and here that sit on either side of that foramen. These condyles are rounded processes with a convex or a sticking out surface, which articulate with the rounded depressions or the concave surfaces of the first vertebra to form our atlanto-occipital joint, or the joint that allows you to nod your head yes. The other landmark on the occipital bone on which you'll be assessed is the external occipital protuberance. So this is the prominent projection in the middle of our occipital bone. And if you feel the back of your head just a bit above your neck, you'll actually be able to feel this landmark. From our external occipital protuberance is a large fibrous elastic ligament called the nuchal ligament. And this extends from this process down to the 7th cervical vertebra to help support the head. Looking internally, and the sphenoid bone forms the middle or the base of the skull. The sphenoid bone looks a little bit like a bat or a butterfly. Anterior to the sphenoid bone is the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone forms part of the floor of the cranial cavity, the middle walls of the eye sockets, and the superior portion of your nasal cavity. Running along the midline of the ethmoid bone is the cribriform plate. So that's this long kind of line or plate down the middle. And then within the cribriform plate are small holes called olfactory foramina. So olfactory referring to smell and foramina referring to multiple holes. And through the olfactory foramina run the branches of the olfactory nerve, which extend up from the olfactory epithelium in your nose. Now, it's difficult to see these tiny holes in this image here, so make sure you take a look at this structure during your lab class. Moving on to our facial bones, and we'll not cover every single facial bone here, but those that we will cover in this unit are the nasal bones. So these are two small flattened rectangular shaped bones that form the bridge or kind of the top part of your nose. The lacrimal bones, which are the smallest bones of the face, and these tiny little purple bones here. These form the medial wall of the eye socket. Within the lacrimal bones is the lacrimal sulcus. So this is this little tiny indent that sits within the lacrimal bone. This houses the lacrimal sac, which collects tears as they leave your eye, and then it passes them back into your nasal cavity. We have the maxilla, or the maxillary bones, which are the two bones of the upper jaw. They form the floor of the eye sockets, part of the lateral walls of the nasal cavity, and then also most of the hard palate, which is the bony portion of the roof of your mouth. The zygomatic bones are more commonly known as your cheekbones. The mandible is your lower jawbone and is actually the strongest of all our facial bones. And on each side of the mandible is a rounded projection called the mandibular condyle, which, as we mentioned before, articulates with the mandibular fossa on our temporal bone to form our temporomandibular or our jaw joint. Now finally, as we learned in the joints module earlier in the semester, holding together each of our cranial bones are sutures. Sutures are immovable joints that are only found within the bones of the skull. The connective tissue which forms the sutures and holds the bones together are considered the ligaments of the skull. And although each specific suture has a specific name, for example, our coronal suture unites our frontal and our parietal bones, and our sagittal suture, which runs along here, holds our two parietal bones together. For the purpose of this unit, you can simply refer to each of them as a suture.